The millionaire left him a $16 million mansion, but the strangest thing in the will was a room nobody was allowed to open. Michael Bennett stood beneath the carved oak ceiling of Caldwell Estate with one hand resting on the neck of his German Shepherd, Ranger, while attorney Laura Mitchell read the final page aloud. Beyond the tall windows, November rain drifted across nearly 80 acres of Pennsylvania woodland, turning the distant hills gray beneath a fading afternoon sky. The mansion was enormous, more than 20,000 square feet of limestone, dark timber, fireplaces, and rooms that seemed to hold their breath. Michael had been inside for less than an hour, yet nothing about the place felt like something he owned. Across the library, Richard Caldwell stood beside the cold fireplace with his arms folded. He was Henry Caldwell's oldest son, and he had barely looked at Michael since they were introduced. Laura adjusted the document in her hands. Mr. Caldwell's instructions require Mr. Bennett to occupy the property for 90 consecutive days before full ownership transfers. Ranger must reside here with him during that period. Michael glanced down. Ranger sat quietly beside his boot, black and tan coat, still damp from the rain. Henry named my dog. Specifically, Laura continued, there is one additional restriction concerning the West Wing. Richard looked toward her. It was the first time Michael saw the man's expression change. That is unnecessary. Laura remained calm. Your father included it in the signed instructions. Michael watched Richard before turning back to her. What restriction? Laura read carefully. The room at the western end of the second-floor corridor is not to be opened by force, damaged, altered, or entered through any other means during the conditional period. Michael frowned. Why? Laura lowered the page. Henry referred to it as the dog's room. Michael almost smiled, but Richard did not. The color seemed to leave his face for half a second before irritation replaced it. My father became sentimental near the end. Laura continued reading. Mr. Bennett may enter the room only when the existing lock can be opened without force. She paused. There is one handwritten instruction attached. Michael waited. Laura turned over a small cream card. Do not force the door. Ranger will tell you when it is time. Silence filled the library. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, old pipes gave a faint metallic knock. Michael looked at Ranger. The shepherd looked back with calm amber eyes, entirely unimpressed by $16 million, inheritance law, or the expectations of dead millionaires. That is it? Michael asked. That is everything Henry wrote about the room. Richard stepped away from the fireplace. Then leave it closed. There is nothing in there worth turning this into some ridiculous treasure hunt. Michael studied him. I did not say anything about treasure. Richard's jaw tightened. Laura quietly gathered the documents. Would you like to see the room? Michael nodded. They climbed the broad staircase to the second floor, Ranger moving beside him. The western corridor grew colder as they walked. Portraits lined the walls, their varnished faces watching from another century. At the far end stood a plain oak door, strangely modest compared with everything around it. No brass nameplate. No decoration. Only an old keyhole beneath a dark iron handle. Michael stopped 10 feet away and loosened Ranger's leash. If Henry's instructions meant anything, this was the moment the dog should react. Ranger looked at the door. He sniffed once. Then he turned away and became interested in a dusty heating vent along the opposite wall. Michael waited. Nothing. Ranger sneezed, walked back toward him, and sat down. Richard gave a humorless smile. There. Mystery solved. Michael looked at the locked door again. Apparently not today. Laura handed him a ring containing the mansion's ordinary keys. None belonged to that lock. Richard started toward the stairs, but Michael noticed him glance back once before disappearing around the corner. It was not curiosity in his eyes. It was recognition. Michael rested his hand on Ranger's head. 3 days earlier, he had been repairing commercial lawn equipment and wondering whether his pickup would survive another winter. Now he owned the keys to a mansion, except for the one door a dead millionaire had forbidden him to force open. And somehow, the only creature Henry trusted to decide when that door should open was a 7-year-old German Shepherd who had just chosen a heating vent instead. 3 days earlier, Michael Bennett had been standing beneath fluorescent lights in the service bay of a landscaping company outside Harrisburg, trying to convince a commercial mower that winter was not an excuse to quit early. The air smelled of gasoline, rubber, and burnt coffee. His hands were dark with grease, His work jacket hung from a nail beside the tool cabinet, and Ranger slept near the office doorway where a rectangle of pale November sunlight warmed the concrete floor. At 43, Michael had learned to appreciate ordinary days. After leaving the United States Marine Corps, he had discovered that civilian life rarely arrived with instructions. He repaired equipment, paid his bills, kept his small rented house clean, and saved whatever remained after groceries, utilities, and Ranger's veterinary care. It was not glamorous. It was his. His telephone rang shortly before noon. "Michael Bennett," a woman asked. "Speaking. My name is Laura Mitchell. I am the attorney for the estate of Henry Caldwell." Michael wiped his hand on a shop towel. The name sounded familiar, but only in the distant way wealthy names often did. Caldwell Developments. Caldwell Charitable Foundations. Buildings with brass plaques. "What can I do for you?" Laura paused. "Mr. Caldwell passed away last week. I am sorry to hear that. He named you in his will." Michael looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd opened one eye, then closed it again. "I think you have the wrong Michael Bennett." Laura confirmed his middle name, age, former military service, and current address. Every detail matched. "Then why would Henry Caldwell put me in his will?" "That is one of several questions he expected you to ask." Michael leaned against the workbench. "Did I know him?" "According to his personal notes, you met once." Something moved at the edge of Michael's memory. Cold air. Headlights. An older man calling into darkness. It vanished before he could place it. "What did he leave me?" Laura answered without drama. "His primary residence and the surrounding property." Michael waited for the correction. None came. "Caldwell Estate." "Yes." "The mansion?" "Yes." Michael gave a quiet breath. "How much is it worth?" "The latest appraisal places the property at approximately $16 million. The number felt almost meaningless. Michael's checking account had less than $4,000 in it. His pickup had crossed 170,000 miles. 16 million belonged to a world where people discussed wings of houses instead of bedrooms. He had family. He did. Then something is wrong. The will is valid. Michael stared through the open service door at bare trees moving in the wind. "What is the catch?" "There are conditions. I would prefer to explain them in person." Laura gave him the address and asked him to come the following afternoon. Then her voice changed slightly. "One more thing. You need to bring Ranger." Michael straightened. "How do you know my dog's name?" "Henry knew it." "How?" "I cannot answer that yet." Michael looked toward the doorway. Ranger was awake now, watching him. What exactly did he know? "That Ranger is a 7-year-old German shepherd and that he lives with you." Michael said nothing. A man he could barely remember had known the name, breed, and age of his dog. That unsettled him more than the inheritance. That evening, Michael drove home beneath a copper-colored sunset. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, nose occasionally lifting toward the cracked window. At a red light, Michael searched Henry Caldwell's name on his telephone, then stopped himself. Whatever waited at that mansion would still be there tomorrow. $16 million, he murmured. Ranger looked at him, then returned his attention to the road. Michael smiled faintly. "Exactly. Sounds suspicious to me too." The light changed. As they drove north, a memory surfaced again, clearer this time. Rain against a windshield. A stranded sedan. An elderly man standing beneath roadside lights with an empty leash in his hand. And somewhere, beyond those lights, a German shepherd waiting to be found. The following afternoon, Michael drove through black iron gates and understood immediately why $16 million could still become a problem. Caldwell Estate appeared at the end of a long driveway lined with bare oaks, its limestone walls glowing pale beneath a cold Pennsylvania sky. The mansion was magnificent from a distance. Up close, Michael noticed cracked mortar, weathered window frames, loose slate near the roofline, and copper gutters stained green with age. Ranger stood behind the passenger seat, nose raised toward the open window as Michael parked beside Laura Mitchell's sedan. Laura met him on the front steps. Richard Caldwell waited inside. Michael recognized him from photographs he had seen that morning. Henry's oldest son, dressed in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent. Richard offered no handshake. "Mr. Bennett." "Michael is fine." Richard looked toward Ranger. "And this is the dog." Michael rested a hand lightly against Ranger's shoulder. "His name is Ranger." Laura led them into the library, where legal documents covered a polished walnut table. She explained the 90-day requirement first. Michael and Ranger had to occupy the mansion continuously during that period. Michael could leave for work, errands, and ordinary daily needs, but Caldwell Estate had to remain his primary residence. He could not sell it, lease it, transfer it, or borrow against it until the condition expired. And if I decide this is insane? Michael asked. The property passes into the Caldwell family trust. Richard leaned against the fireplace, which is where it should have gone in the first place. Michael ignored him and turned another page. The numbers waiting there were less romantic than the mansion. Property taxes, specialized insurance, heating costs for more than 20,000 square feet, grounds maintenance, roof repairs, plumbing inspections, electrical work. One preliminary estimate for masonry restoration alone was larger than Michael's annual salary. So Henry left me a $16 million house I might not be able to afford for 16 weeks. Laura almost smiled. 90 days is closer to 13 weeks. That makes me feel much better. Richard finally stepped forward and placed a white envelope on the table. There is another option. Inside was a written offer for $200,000. Michael read it carefully. Richard would pay him once Michael legally abandoned the conditional inheritance and allowed the estate to revert. $200,000 was not imaginary money. It was a newer truck, a down payment on a house, maybe his own equipment repair business. It was years of breathing room. Michael looked at Richard. You just told me this place is an expensive problem. It is. Then why are you offering $200,000 to make it your problem? Richard's expression remained controlled. Because it belongs with my family. Your father disagreed. The room went quiet. Ranger walked toward the library windows and sniffed the baseboard, uninterested in the tension behind him. Michael returned the offer to its envelope. I am not saying no forever. I am saying no today. Richard gave a small nod. The house will help you change your mind. Laura spent the next hour showing Michael the essential rooms and mechanical systems. Several bathrooms had been shut down to prevent plumbing damage. One guest bedroom showed water staining near the ceiling. The boiler worked, but an inspection was overdue. Nothing was catastrophic. Together, however, the problems formed a quiet army of invoices. Near sunset, they reached the western end of the second floor. The plain oak door waited exactly where Michael would see it 3 days later, silent beneath a narrow window. Laura explained Henry's final restriction. Do not force the door. Ranger will tell you when it is time. Michael loosened Ranger's leash. The German shepherd approached within several feet, sniffed the air, then walked past the mysterious door without hesitation. He stopped at an old heating vent and investigated it instead. Richard watched from the stairwell. For the first time all afternoon, relief crossed his face. It disappeared quickly, but Michael saw it. He looked from Richard to the locked room. Whatever Henry had left behind that door, his son was not afraid Michael would find it. He was afraid Ranger eventually would. For the first 6 days, Ranger showed more interest in the mansion's kitchen than in the room Henry Caldwell had supposedly chosen him to unlock. Each morning, Michael walked the western corridor before breakfast. Each morning, Ranger passed the plain oak door without hesitation. He sniffed heating vents, investigated old rugs, paused beside windows where squirrels moved through bare branches, but never gave the locked room more than a glance. By the 6th evening, Michael began to wonder whether Henry's final instruction had been nothing more than an old man's private joke. Rain had cleared, leaving the Pennsylvania night cold and bright. Michael sat in the library with repair estimates spread across the walnut table while Ranger slept near the fireplace. The numbers were relentless. A roofing contractor wanted nearly $30,000 for urgent slate work. The boiler needed parts. 2 windows required replacement before winter. Michael rubbed his eyes and looked at Richard's unopened offer across the table. $200,000 suddenly felt less like temptation and more like common sense. Ranger stirred. His ears lifted, not toward the west wing, but toward a narrow bookshelf beside the fireplace. He rose, crossed the room, and stopped beneath a framed photograph Michael had barely noticed. Ranger sniffed the lower edge of the frame. Then Saturday, what now? Michael asked. He lifted the photograph from its hook. 3 figures stood on the mansion's front steps beneath summer sunlight. Henry was younger by several decades. Beside him stood a lean man wearing a United States Marine Corps uniform. At the man's knee sat a German shepherd with a broad chest, dark saddle, and steady eyes. Michael turned the frame over. A handwritten label identified them. Henry Caldwell. James Walker. Duke. Michael stared at the Marine's face. Something about the photograph carried the ease of an old friendship, the kind that existed before money complicated rooms and families. Beneath the names was another sentence, written in Henry's hand. He waited 7 years. Michael read it again. Who waited? Ranger touched his nose to the back of the frame. Michael removed the cardboard backing and found nothing hidden beneath it. No letter. No key. Just the photograph and 5 unexplained words. He carried it upstairs. Ranger followed until they reached the western corridor. Michael stopped before the locked room and held the photograph near the door. Duke. Ranger sniffed the frame, then the bottom of the door. For a moment Michael thought something had changed. Ranger inhaled twice. Then he turned away and walked back toward the stairs. Helpful. Michael returned to the library, but Ranger did not follow immediately. Instead, the shepherd paused beside a section of baseboard near the fireplace. His nose moved slowly along the wood. Michael watched from across the room. Ranger returned to the same spot and inhaled again. Michael crouched beside him. The baseboard looked ordinary except for a thin line where one section met the next. He pressed it gently. It shifted less than 1/8 of an inch. Old houses moved. Wood contracted. Nothing unusual about that. Then Ranger lowered his nose to the seam and gave a quiet breath. Michael caught it too. Not a smell exactly, but a faint current of cooler air against his fingertips. He fetched a flashlight and examined the molding. One brass screw was newer than the others. Michael removed it carefully, then another. The narrow panel loosened without damage. Behind it was a shallow cavity between the wall studs. His flashlight revealed something dark resting inside. Leather. Michael reached in and slowly withdrew an old German shepherd collar, dry with age but carefully wrapped in cloth. A brass tag hung from the buckle. One word was engraved across it. Duke. Ranger stepped closer and sniffed the collar with sudden concentration. Beneath it, deeper inside the cavity, Michael saw the edge of a small wooden box. He reached toward it, then stopped. Scratched into the wood above the hiding place were 5 more words in Henry Caldwell's handwriting. If Ranger noticed Duke, continue. Michael looked at the shepherd beside him. For 6 days, Ranger had ignored the forbidden room. Completely. Maybe Henry had never expected him to start there. Michael carefully pulled the wooden box from the wall cavity and carried it to the library table. Ranger followed with Duke's collar scent, still holding his attention. The box was no treasure chest. It was plain walnut, worn at the corners, with a small brass latch that opened without a key. Michael lifted the lid. Inside lay a pair of military identification tags, a small brass key, 2 photographs, and an old cassette tape protected inside a paper sleeve. No cash. No bonds. Nothing that could pay the roofing contractor. Michael picked up the identification tags first. James Walker, United States Marine Corps. He looked toward the photograph Ranger had noticed earlier. The same Marine stood beside Henry and Duke on the mansion steps. In the second photograph, James sat alone near a wide window with Duke leaning against his leg. Someone had written a date from more than 20 years earlier on the back. Beneath it were the same words Michael had already seen. He waited 7 years. Michael turned to the cassette. A white label carried Henry's handwriting. For Michael Bennett. Play after Ranger finds Duke. You planned this pretty carefully, Michael murmured. Ranger sat beside him. Michael searched the mansion until he found an old cassette player in a cabinet near Henry's study. The machine needed fresh batteries, but it still worked. He inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room. Then an elderly man's voice emerged, quiet and tired. Michael, if you are hearing this, Ranger finally noticed Duke. Michael froze. Hearing his own name was strange enough. Hearing Ranger's was worse. Henry continued. Do not be impressed. Dogs notice what people leave behind. Scent stays in leather longer than pride stays in men. Michael glanced at Duke's collar. The room upstairs is not ready for you yet. Neither are you ready for it. Keep the key. You will know when to use it. The recording paused for several seconds before Henry spoke again. James Walker was my closest friend. Duke belonged to him before he belonged to me. If you want to understand why you are in this house, understand them. First, the tape clicked off. Michael remained still. Ranger lowered himself beside the table, chin resting across his front paws. Michael examined the brass key. It was old, narrow, and clearly too small for the heavy lock on the forbidden room. Another clue, but not the answer. He turned Duke's collar over. The leather was cracked near the buckle. On the inside, almost hidden beneath years of wear, were 4 stamped words. He always came home. Michael felt the old memory return again. Rain. Headlights. An empty leash. A frightened older man calling a dog's name into darkness. Duke. This time Michael remembered the name clearly. Years earlier, on a cold night outside Harrisburg, he had stopped after seeing a stranded sedan near the shoulder. An older man had been searching for a German shepherd that slipped away when a car door opened. Michael had helped because leaving did not feel like an option, but the man's face remained blurred in memory. Had it been Henry? Before Michael could follow the thought further, Ranger rose and walked toward the window. He stared into the dark grounds for several seconds, then returned to Duke's collar and sniffed it again. Michael looked at the photograph of James beside that same window. 7 years. He still did not know who had waited or for whom. He placed the key in his pocket and rewound the cassette. Just before the tape returned to the beginning, another few seconds of recording surfaced after what Michael had assumed was silence. Henry's voice came through one final time. And Michael, when Richard offers you more money, ask yourself why he needs you gone before Ranger reaches that door. Richard returned the following afternoon, less than 24 hours after Michael heard Henry's warning. He arrived while a heating contractor was explaining that 2 circulation pumps needed replacement before temperatures dropped below freezing. The roofing estimate still waited on the library table. Beside it sat an insurance notice Michael had read 3 times without finding a number he liked. By the time Richard entered carrying another leather folder, Michael understood exactly why $500,000 could sound like. Mercy, you look tired, Richard said. Your father left me a large house. He left you an expensive problem. Richard placed the folder on the table and opened it. $500,000. Michael stared at the figure. No complicated conditions beyond legally abandoning the inheritance before the 90-day requirement was completed. $500,000 could buy a comfortable home, replace his aging pickup, and give him enough capital to open the repair shop he had imagined for years. He could walk away from leaking slate, aging pipes, mysterious rooms, and a dead millionaire's unfinished puzzle. Why 500? Michael asked. Richard remained standing. Because I want this settled. Before Ranger reaches that door? Richard's expression changed. Only slightly. Enough. Michael leaned back. Henry said you would offer more. Richard looked toward Duke's collar resting beside the cassette player. You found that? Ranger did. Then you know my father spent years preserving memories that should have been allowed to rest. That does not answer my question. Richard exhaled. There are family matters in that room. Private things. My father had every right to remember them. He did not have to turn them into a test for a stranger. Michael looked at the contract again. His hand moved toward the pen. Ranger lay near the fireplace, watching him without understanding what $500,000 meant. That was almost comforting. Dogs did not know market value. They knew routine, trust, scent, and whether the person beside them came home. Michael picked up the pen. For several seconds, he imagined the relief of signing. Then his eyes settled on Duke's collar. He remembered Henry's voice through the static. Dogs notice what people leave behind. Michael set the pen down. Not today. Richard closed his eyes briefly. You are risking your future over a room you have never seen. Maybe. Michael slid the folder back. But you are offering $500,000 because you are afraid I will. Richard gathered the papers without another word. After his car disappeared beyond the gates, Michael stood alone in the library while evening settled. Across the estate, the heating contractor had gone. The house seemed colder without voices inside it. Ranger rose and stretched. Instead of heading toward the kitchen as he usually did, he walked into the hall. Michael followed. Ranger climbed the main staircase, crossed the second floor, and turned west. Michael slowed. For 6 days, the German shepherd had ignored that corridor. Now he moved through it without hesitation. At the far end, Ranger stopped before the forbidden oak door. He did not scratch. He did not bark. He lowered his nose to the gap beneath it and inhaled for several seconds. Then he lay down. Michael stood behind him, listening to the old mansion settle around them. Now, Ranger remained still. Michael crouched and felt beneath the door. A faint current of cool air touched his fingers. Mixed with the dry scent of old wood was something familiar from downstairs. Leather. Duke's collar. Michael reached into his pocket and removed the small brass key. He had already decided it was too narrow for the door's obvious lock. But now, kneeling beside Ranger, he noticed a second keyhole almost hidden inside the decorative iron plate beneath the handle. Smaller. Older. Michael inserted Henry's key. It fit perfectly. He looked at Ranger once more. The shepherd did not move. Michael turned the key. Somewhere inside the door, a mechanism released with a quiet click. For the first time since Henry Caldwell died, the dog's room was ready to open. Michael pushed the oak door inward and waited for the treasure Henry had worked so hard to hide. Instead, he found a room built around memory. A single lamp came on automatically, spreading warm light across dark wood walls. Ranger entered slowly behind him, nose moving through air that smelled of cedar, dust, and old leather. Against one wall stood a narrow dog bed covered by a faded blue blanket. Above it hung photographs of Duke at different ages. Duke beside James Walker on the mansion steps. Duke running across a summer field. Duke sitting in falling snow. Duke lying beneath a wide window overlooking the driveway. Michael approached that photograph. On the frame, Henry had written the same words again. He waited 7 years. Nearby, James Walker's Marine Corps commendations rested behind glass beside letters addressed to Henry. This was not a secret room built for wealth. It was a place where one man had preserved another man's absence. Ranger crossed to the old dog bed and sniffed carefully, then moved toward the window. Michael watched him stand in the exact place Duke had occupied in the photograph. So this was your room, Michael whispered. Ranger turned away from the glass and walked toward a heavy cabinet beneath a row of bookshelves. He lowered his nose to the floor and inhaled. Michael noticed the curtain beside the cabinet moving slightly, although the window was closed. Airflow. He knelt and felt a cool draft near the baseboard. The cabinet had small brass wheels hidden beneath its carved feet. Michael rolled it forward several inches. Behind it, set flush into the wall near the floor, was a steel safe door. There you are. The safe required no puzzle. A sealed envelope taped above the dial contained written instructions from Henry and a combination Laura was authorized to verify. Michael called her immediately. She arrived 40 minutes later and stood silently inside Duke's room before examining the envelope. Henry told me I might receive this call, she said. He never told me why. Together they followed the instructions. The safe opened. Again, there were no stacks of cash. Inside were organized folders, bank correspondence, property records, certificates for authenticated artwork, investment summaries, and documents identifying a private trust established years earlier. Laura sat at the small desk and began reading. Her expression grew more serious with every page. This trust was kept separate from the ordinary estate, meaning the mansion was only part of what Henry intended you to inherit. Michael looked at the folders. How much are we talking about? I cannot responsibly answer until these accounts are verified. She turned another page. But the figures referenced here suggest more than $50 million in combined assets. Michael sat down on the edge of Duke's old bed. $500,000 had nearly convinced him to leave that afternoon. Now a fortune 100 times larger appeared to be waiting behind a legal condition he still did not fully understand. Ranger returned to the window. Michael felt no excitement yet, only disbelief. Did Richard know? Laura shook her head. He may have suspected Henry created something outside the family estate. That does not mean he knew the value. She lifted the final folder. Beneath it lay a cream envelope. Michael's name was written across the front. Underneath were 7 words. For Michael Bennett, the man who brought Duke home. Michael stared at the sentence. The rainy roadside memory returned completely. The older man with the empty leash had been Henry. The missing German shepherd had been Duke. Michael opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line answered one question and created another. James gave me Duke when he knew he would not be coming back. Michael looked toward the photograph beside the window. Ranger had settled beneath it now, resting where Duke had once waited. Michael unfolded the remaining pages. Somewhere inside Henry Caldwell's final words was the reason a dog had waited 7 years, the reason Richard wanted this room closed, and the reason one forgotten act of kindness had just placed more than $50 million within reach of a man who had never asked for any of it. Michael read Henry's letter beside the window where Duke had once waited. James Walker had been Henry's closest friend since they were boys, long before Caldwell Estate became a symbol of wealth and long before business turned Henry's name into something strangers recognized. James chose the United States Marine Corps, while Henry entered his father's company. Yet distance never ended their friendship. Years later, James came home with Duke, a German shepherd whose loyalty seemed almost inseparable from the Marine beside him. When James learned that his health would eventually prevent him from caring for Duke, he asked Henry for one promise: give him a home. Henry agreed. After James passed away, Duke moved into Caldwell Estate, but every afternoon he returned to the same west-facing window. He watched the driveway until sunset. Days became months. Months became years. Henry changed furniture, renovated hallways, and watched seasons turn across the Pennsylvania hills, but Duke kept returning to that window. 7 years. He was not confused. Henry had written. He remembered. Michael lowered the letter and looked at Ranger resting beneath the photograph. The room suddenly felt less like a memorial and more like a promise someone had refused to throw away. Henry continued. As Duke grew older, he finally stopped waiting by the window every day, though he still slept facing the door. Then came the rainy night Michael now remembered completely. Henry had been driving home when his car developed a mechanical problem. Startled by thunder when Henry opened the rear door, Duke slipped free and disappeared beyond the roadside trees. Henry searched through the rain until a pickup stopped. Michael had been younger then, recently out of the Marine Corps and driving home after helping a friend repair equipment. He saw an older man holding an empty leash and pulled over. What does he answer to? Michael had asked. Duke. Michael took a flashlight and searched. Nearly 2 hours later, he found the German shepherd beneath an abandoned picnic shelter less than a mile away. Duke followed him back through the rain. Henry tried to give Michael $10,000. Michael refused. He belongs with you. That is enough. Michael had forgotten those words almost immediately. Henry carried them for years. The letter explained that Henry later learned Michael's name from the roadside assistance report and quietly followed only enough public information to know that Michael was doing well. When he learned Michael had adopted Ranger, another German shepherd, the old memory returned with unexpected force. Henry did not believe Michael deserved a fortune because he had found Duke. He trusted Michael because Michael had refused to place a price on returning something another person loved. The private trust had been created afterward, separate from the family estate. Henry did not accuse Richard of being cruel. His son understood money extremely well, perhaps too well. Henry wanted part of his legacy placed with someone who understood responsibility before ownership. Michael reached the final paragraph. Money tells you what something costs. A dog tells you who stayed. If you complete the 90 days, the trust is yours to direct. Do not build a monument to me. Do not preserve my name because you think you owe me. Use what I leave to help someone find the road home. Michael folded the letter carefully. Laura remained near the safe, giving him silence. Richard thought this room held money, Michael said. Probably, she answered. But Henry made sure money was the least important thing in it. Ranger rose and walked to the window. Outside, evening had settled over the long driveway. Michael joined him and rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. For 7 years, Duke had watched this same road for a Marine who would never walk up it again. Years later, another Marine had unknowingly brought Duke home through the rain. Now Ranger stood in the same place, not waiting for anyone. Michael was already beside him, and for the first time since entering Caldwell Estate, Michael understood that Henry had never been testing whether he could keep a mansion. He had been asking whether Michael still knew what it meant to stay. On the 90th morning, Michael woke before sunrise and found Ranger sitting beside the bedroom window, watching fresh snow settle across Caldwell Estate. The Pennsylvania hills had disappeared beneath white silence, and the long driveway looked nothing like the road Duke had watched for 7 years. At 9 o'clock, Laura arrived with the final documents. Financial specialists had verified the private trust at slightly more than $53 million, spread across investments, land holdings, protected accounts, and authenticated assets. Michael signed the necessary papers slowly. The numbers still felt impossible, but it no longer felt like the most important thing Henry had left him. Richard came later that afternoon. He stood in the library where his $500,000 offer had once rested between them. So it is finished, he said. The 90 days are finished. Richard looked toward the west. Wing. My father always believed people could be measured by what they refused to sell. Michael studied him. There was no anger left in Richard's voice, only something tired. He did not leave that room to embarrass you. I know. Richard looked down for a moment. I think I was afraid there was something in there proving he trusted a stranger more than his own son. Michael shook his head. It was never about who he trusted more. It was about what he wanted done next. Richard nodded once and left without another argument. By the following summer, Caldwell Estates sounded different. The eastern wing had been converted into temporary housing for veterans rebuilding their civilian lives. Several unused buildings near the old stables became rehabilitation spaces for retired working dogs and German Shepherd rescues, with heated sleeping areas, fenced exercise fields, and rooms for veterinary care. Michael named the program Homeward House. Henry's name appeared nowhere on the entrance. Neither did Michael's. The west wing remained quiet. Duke's room was preserved almost exactly as Henry had left it. James Walker's military identification tags stayed behind glass. Duke's old bed remained beneath the photographs. His collar rested beside Henry's final letter. Michael repaired the wide window, but never replaced it. One evening the following winter, snow began falling again. Michael entered Duke's room and found Ranger lying beneath that window. The German Shepherd was 7 now, his black and tan coat warmed by amber light from the hallway. Outside, several veterans were walking dogs across the grounds before dinner. Laughter drifted faintly from the main house. Somewhere near the stables, an older German Shepherd barked once, then settled. Michael sat beside Ranger. He thought about Duke watching this driveway year after year, waiting for James to return. Henry had never corrected that loyalty, because perhaps there was nothing to correct. Some love did not disappear when hope became impossible. It simply learned to live beside absence. Michael opened the window 2 inches. Cold air entered carrying the scent of snow and pine. Ranger lifted his nose, then rested his head against Michael's knee. "You are not waiting, are you?" Michael whispered. Ranger closed his eyes. Michael smiled and looked across the illuminated grounds. More than $53 million had repaired roofs, restored buildings, paid for veterinary care, and created rooms where people could begin again. But money had not created the reason those rooms mattered. That had started years earlier beside a rainy highway, when one man saw another holding an empty leash and decided to stop. Michael reached down and rubbed Ranger gently behind one ear. Duke had spent 7 years waiting for someone he loved to come home. Henry had spent the rest of his life remembering what loyalty looked like. And now, in the same mansion where an old dog once watched an empty driveway, veterans and forgotten working dogs were arriving through the gates to find warm beds, open doors, and someone waiting for them. Michael closed the window against the cold and stood. Ranger rose beside him. Together they walked toward the voices downstairs, leaving Duke's room quiet behind them. This time, no one at the window was waiting for home. Home was already there.